Hey guys, tonight's story is about one of the most daring missions in modern history, a stealth operation carried out by the Navy SEALs that ended the decade-long hunt for Osama bin Laden. In the dead of night, a small team flew silently into Pakistan, navigating a high-stakes world of guards, alarms, hidden threats, all to strike the world's most wanted man. No chaos, no crowd, just a dark compound, quiet corridors, and the cold precision of a mission that changed the course of history. So before you get comfortable, if you enjoy what I do here, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep making these videos. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see you guys tuning in every night. Now, dim the lights, put on some headphones for a more immersive experience, and let's ease into tonight's story together. For almost 10 years, America had been hunting one man like a ghost in the mountains. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind September 11th, had killed nearly 3,000 Americans and started a war that was still burning on May 2nd, 2011. The United States had crushed the Taliban government that sheltered him, but bin Laden himself kept slipping away like smoke. He'd escaped from Afghanistan while American troops occupied the country and disappeared into Pakistan's wild frontier. The CIA had been chasing shadows for years with nothing to show for it. Pakistan's mountainous regions were perfect for hiding. Little government control, lots of caves, and plenty of people willing to look the other way for the right price. Then 2010 brought the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Intelligence leads pointed to a compound in Abbottabad, a quiet Pakistani city that nobody would suspect. The building looked ordinary enough from the outside, but something felt wrong about it. American agents started watching the place like hawks, taking surveillance photos and studying every detail. What followed became one of the most complex spy operations in US history. The three-story compound was heavily guarded and sitting in enemy territory. America had to rely on local help to gather information, spending months learning every brick and window of the building. They mapped out guard routines, studied the layout, even counted how many people lived there. But one crucial piece remained missing. Bin Laden was so paranoid about security that cameras never caught him coming or going. Everything stayed circumstantial, but after extended surveillance, intelligence officials felt confident they'd found their target. Time for talking was over. On April 29th, President Obama sat down for the briefing that would change everything. His security team was split down the middle about the operation, and the concerns were serious enough to give anyone nightmares. If things went sideways, elite American troops would either die or get captured deep in enemy territory. Dead soldiers would be tragic enough, but captured ones could be forced to reveal classified information that would compromise national security for decades. Add the lingering doubts about whether bin Laden was actually in that compound, and many advisors thought the risk outweighed the potential reward. The whole operation could be a massive waste of resources chasing a ghost. President Obama listened to all the concerns, weighed the options, then made his choice. He gave the green light to what would become Operation Neptune Spear. If they were going to do this, they'd need the absolute best people available. Enter SEAL Team 6, the military's ultimate problem solvers. This elite Navy SEAL squadron answers directly to the Joint Special Operations Command and handles missions so classified most government officials don't even know they exist. Their resume includes hostage rescue, special espionage, counter-terrorism, infrastructure attacks, and direct action against America's deadliest enemies. If anyone could pull off this impossible mission, it was them. The mission briefing was simple: capture or kill. Officially, America doesn't execute enemies who surrender, but everyone in that room knew Osama bin Laden would never give up without a fight. To make this work, they'd have to implement some seriously risky strategies. Planning had consumed the better part of a year, ever since intelligence reports first pointed to the Abbottabad compound. Military strategists had considered every possible approach, and each one had serious problems. The simplest option involved working with Pakistani military forces, but Pakistan's government wasn't exactly friendly these days. American officials worried that bin Laden could get tipped off if too many people knew about the operation in advance. Stealth bombers offered another solution. They could turn the entire compound into a smoking crater and guarantee bin Laden wouldn't escape this time. But bombing meant no way to confirm the kill, and this particular target had slipped away from American operations before. So the government decided to go old school with a direct assault. SEAL Team 6 would fly in using modified Black Hawk helicopters designed for stealth operations. These birds were engineered to run quiet and slip under enemy radar without detection. America knew Pakistani military capabilities inside and out, since US advisors had trained and equipped them for years. This knowledge gave American forces confidence they could avoid detection during the infiltration phase. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity: get to the compound without alerting Pakistani forces, eliminate the target, then disappear before anyone knew what happened. Once bin Laden was down, the team would beat a hasty retreat back to friendly territory. Everything depended on speed, stealth, and the element of surprise. One mistake could turn a surgical strike into an international incident. May 1st, 1:22 p.m. sharp. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta got the word from President Obama and told Admiral William McRaven to launch the operation. Within 2 hours, the President and his national security team would gather in the Situation Room to watch history unfold through night vision drone footage. The roughly 24 Navy SEALs heading into danger would temporarily transfer to CIA control, making this technically not a military mission. Legal paperwork mattered, even when hunting the world's most wanted terrorist. These were going to be some of the most critical minutes in modern American history. For the men on the ground, every second would feel like an eternity. While 24 SEALs would breach the compound, the full operation involved 79 commandos plus one very special team member. Cairo, a Belgian Malinois dog, was there to alert SEALs to sudden activity, Pakistani military approaching, or anyone trying to escape. The core assault team was backed up by a dog handler, interpreters, pilots, intelligence agents, and tech experts who would make everything possible. But success or failure would hinge on the men entering that compound. One wrong move could spell disaster for everyone involved. 3:30 a.m. give or take. 2 helicopters descended on the Abbottabad compound like mechanical ghosts. Other helicopters waited nearby in case things went sideways, but these two would carry out the main event. Flying low to avoid detection, the stealth Black Hawks hovered over the compound grounds. The first helicopter deployed ropes to lower its team, while the second headed to the northeast corner to drop off its interpreter, dog, handler, and 4 SEALs. If everything went smoothly, they'd be inside the compound within minutes. But Mother Nature had different plans. The first helicopter flew straight into a vortex ring state, an air phenomenon caused by higher temperatures creating dangerous air currents. The rotor's air pressure didn't work properly, the helicopter got knocked off balance, and it scraped the compound's back wall. The tail rotor took serious damage, and the bird started rolling over. The quick-thinking pilot drove it nose first into the ground, preventing total disaster. The SEALs and crew escaped uninjured after a rough landing that could have killed everyone. Had this blown their secret mission? Apparently not. No hostile fire came from the compound, meaning they hadn't been detected despite the crash. The damaged helicopter sat against the compound walls. The other bird had landed safely outside, and the rest of the team was scaling walls to reunite. Next step, breaching the compound. That's where the SEALs explosives team would earn their pay. They needed to get inside fast and hit everyone with shock and awe. 10 years of searching had come down to this moment. 3:33 a.m. The SEALs needed to get inside fast. They placed small bombs against the guest house doors and blew them wide open, one after another. The explosions lit up the night like deadly fireworks. Now came the hard part, storming through the compound and racing up those stairs. The first room they hit on the ground floor held 2 grown men. Neither one was their guy, not Osama bin Laden. The soldiers zip-tied them and kept moving. Time was everything now. Something felt wrong, though. Each floor they climbed revealed small faces peering from doorways, kids everywhere. This place wasn't just some terrorist hideout. It was a twisted family home, where dangerous men had dragged their children into the line of fire. What kind of father does that? With each step higher, the stakes got deadlier. The real target was still somewhere above them. 3:35 a.m. Now things get messy. Different people tell different stories about what went down next. The SEALs hit the second floor and ran into trouble. They found bin Laden's courier, a guy named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, right there waiting for them. SEAL Mark Owen later wrote a book about this moment. He said the courier had a gun and started shooting at them. One SEAL got hurt, but not badly. They shot back and killed the guy. Pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. Other sources paint a different picture. They claim the SEALs cut the power first, caught the courier off guard, and took him out before he could even fight back. Truth is, nobody knows for sure what really happened in those dark hallways. What everyone agrees on, They still hadn't found their main target. 3:37 a.m. Time to climb again. Each step up meant more danger. The SEALs had already dealt with the courier, his brother and his wife, all dead or captured. As they moved up the stairs, another enemy appeared. This one gave them hope, though. After they killed him, they figured out who he was, one of bin Laden's sons. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree in the terrorism business. If Junior was here, Daddy couldn't be far behind. 3:39 a.m., one floor left. The third floor was all that remained between them and either victory or crushing disappointment. The SEALs tried to stay calm, but doubt crept in. Bin Laden was slippery as an eel, always one step ahead of everyone hunting him. Maybe he was already gone. Maybe this was another dead end. But when they broke through to the third floor, everything changed. There he was, standing in the main room like some ghost made real. Osama bin Laden himself, wearing that same loose white tunic from all his creepy videos. No weapons visible. For a split second he poked his head out of the bedroom, probably wondering what all the noise was about. Bad move. The SEALs didn't hesitate. They fired immediately, hitting him. Blood, chaos, panic. But the guy was tough. He managed to stumble back into the bedroom. The chase was on. Inside that bedroom, reality hit like a sledgehammer. The room was packed with bin Laden's female relatives, wives, sisters, daughters maybe. A whole family living with a monster. One woman came straight at the SEALs like she was charging into battle. They shot her in the leg, grabbed her and kept moving. These weren't soldiers, they were desperate people protecting someone who'd brought death to their doorstep. Now for the million-dollar question. What happened next? Depends who's telling the story. Matt Bissonnette was there that night. He says bin Laden was already dying from those first shots. His wives were trying to shield him, which made sense. Any of them could have had a bomb strapped on. When the SEALs pushed past the women, they found bin Laden on the floor bleeding out but still moving. They finished the job with multiple shots. Clean, simple, over. But wait, there's another version. Robert O'Neill, another SEAL who later went public, tells it differently. In his story, bin Laden wasn't some dying man on the floor. He was still fighting, still dangerous. According to O'Neill, bin Laden grabbed one of the women and used her as a human shield. Classic coward move. As bin Laden pushed this poor woman toward the SEALs, O'Neill took 2 clean shots right to the forehead. Boom, game over. Which story is true? The Navy's official report backs up Bissonnette's version. Either way, the result was the same. America's most wanted terrorist was finally dead. The SEALs radioed back those famous words, "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo." Mission accomplished. The whole operation took less than 15 minutes from start to finish. Not one SEAL died or got seriously hurt. Textbook perfection. Back in Washington, President Obama watched it all unfold in the Situation Room. When the confirmation came through, he said exactly what everyone was thinking. We got him. But the night wasn't over yet. 3:55 a.m. The SEALs moved fast. They grabbed bin Laden's body and carried it downstairs like a sack of potatoes. No ceremony, no drama, just business. But the real work was just starting. This place might be hiding secrets worth their weight in gold. They tore through that bedroom looking for anything useful. Found 2 guns, an assault rifle and a pistol. Neither one was loaded. Turns out bin Laden wasn't ready for a fight after all. Maybe he thought his hideout was bulletproof. Wrong again. Now came the tricky part. What to do with all the people still alive? The compound was crawling with women and kids. America didn't want to drag a bunch of scared civilians back home, so they zip-tied everyone and left them outside for Pakistani forces to find later. Most of them stayed quiet and scared. But not bin Laden's wife, Amal Ahmed Abdul Fattah. This woman had fire in her belly. She spent the entire cleanup yelling at the SEALs in Arabic, probably calling them every curse word in the book. True believer till the end. She'd eventually get shipped back to Yemen, along with most of the others. Time to get out of there. 4:05 a.m. Everything valuable was packed up tight. Bin Laden's body, computers, papers, hard drives, anything that might spill secrets. The first helicopter was loaded and ready to fly. They kept it low and quiet, just like landing. Back home they'd be heroes, but right here, right now, they were trespassers with guns. Pakistan wouldn't exactly throw them a parade if they got caught. Just like before, SEAL Team 6 vanished into the night like ghosts. Perfect getaway. But they had one messy problem left behind. 4:08 a.m., that crashed Black Hawk wasn't going anywhere. Pakistani forces would show up soon, and that helicopter was packed with military secrets. It wasn't just any old chopper. This thing had stealth features that America didn't want anyone else getting their hands on. So they did what they do best. More explosives. Same portable bombs they'd used to blow open doors now turned their own helicopter into scrap metal and smoke. Took maybe 3 minutes tops. One of the backup helicopters swooped in, grabbed the remaining SEALs, and they were gone. Mission complete. Now came the boring part, the long ride home. 5:53 a.m. The flight back took over an hour and a half, 3 times longer than the actual mission. But they had to get back to safe ground in Afghanistan, where America had been fighting since 9/11 kicked everything off. The Pakistanis probably wouldn't shoot down a US helicopter, but why take chances? So the Americans played it smart. As explosions lit up the compound and crowds gathered, a US officer who spoke Urdu told everyone this was a Pakistani military operation. Stay back, nothing to see here. It worked like a charm. The helicopters landed safely at Bagram airfield, carrying the body of the world's most wanted terrorist. Now came the hard part, dealing with what they'd done. 7:01 a.m., back in Washington, the party was on hold. One big question hung in the air like smoke. Was this really bin Laden? The guy was famous for using lookalikes and fake deaths. America had been fooled before by dead ringers and clever tricks. So everyone sat on their hands waiting for the science guys to do their thing. DNA tests, measurements, scars, dental records, the whole 9 yards. Over an hour passed before the word came back from Afghanistan. It was him. They really got him this time. The American people were about to find out they could finally sleep a little easier. Evening of May 1st, something was up. Word spread that President Obama would speak to the nation that night. Usually when he gave speeches, they happened during prime time when everyone was watching TV. Probably ruined a lot of dinner plans over the years, but this was different. No advance warning, no prime time slot. Political junkies stayed glued to their screens waiting. Obama didn't take the podium until almost midnight. When he started talking, everyone knew this was huge. 11:35 p.m. Tonight I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women and children. The country exploded. Almost 10 years since 9/11, and Americans had been living with this fear hanging over their heads like a dark cloud. At baseball games, fans screamed louder than home runs. Democrats celebrated Obama's biggest win. Republicans wondered if they should even bother running against him next year. America had its revenge. 12:59 a.m., 1 hour after Obama's speech, the military had one last problem to solve: what to do with the body. They'd tested everything twice, checked every detail. It was definitely bin Laden. They'd squeezed every bit of useful information out of the corpse. Now they had to get rid of it. But here's the thing. Nobody wanted him. Every country on earth had wanted this guy dead or behind bars. Even Pakistan and Afghanistan, places where he'd hidden for years, considered him poison. No nation would give him a grave because it would become a shrine for terrorists. Nobody wants thousands of Al-Qaeda fanatics making pilgrimages to their backyard every year. So what do you do with the body of the world's most hated man? Why not just burn the body and call it a day? Simple answer, that would break Islamic rules. And America didn't want to make things worse. Bin Laden's followers were already going to be mad enough about their leader being dead. No point poking the bear. So they came up with a different plan. They loaded his body onto the aircraft carrier Carl Vinson and called up Saudi Arabia. Hey, he's your citizen. What should we do with him? The Saudis basically said, not our problem anymore. Do whatever you want. Just don't drag us into it. Perfect. Time for a burial at sea. They actually did it right, following Muslim traditions. Someone read Arabic prayers over the body, probably the weirdest funeral service in military history. Then they wrapped him in a white sheet, stuffed him in a weighted bag with hundreds of pounds of iron chains, and put the whole thing on a wooden board. One tilt forward, and Osama bin Laden slipped into the ocean forever. No grave for terrorists to visit, no shrine for enemies to attack. Just fish food at the bottom of the sea. Mission truly complete. Now came the boring stuff. 3 a.m. local time in Pakistan, some poor army chief got the phone call nobody wants to get. The US chairman of the Joint Chiefs was on the line, probably trying to sound friendly while explaining how American helicopters had just blown stuff up in Pakistan without asking permission first. That conversation must have been interesting. Lots of angry words that got smoothed over with diplomatic language. Pakistan claimed they had nothing to do with the operation, which was probably true. Their fighter jets did scramble to check things out, but they showed up fashionably late, after all the Americans had already gone home. The actual raid took less than an hour, but the mess it created, that would drag on for years. People love to argue about everything, and this was no different. Was it legal for America to raid another country's soil? The post-9/11 laws gave the US pretty wide permission to hunt terrorists anywhere, but Pakistan wasn't exactly thrilled about uninvited guests with helicopters. America wanted answers about how bin Laden had been hiding in Pakistan for so long. Pakistan wanted America to stop treating their country like a playground. Neither side got what they wanted. Of course, conspiracy nuts crawled out of the woodwork, claiming bin Laden was still alive. The government shut most of that down by releasing photos of the dead terrorist. Hard to argue with a bullet hole in the forehead. Then came the inevitable book deals. Once some details got declassified, SEALs started writing memoirs. Each one made the author sound like the real hero of the story. Shocking, right? Hollywood couldn't resist either. Just a year and a half later, Zero Dark 30 hit theaters. They made the real hero a fictional CIA analyst played by Jessica Chastain. Because apparently Navy SEALs aren't dramatic enough for the movies. That's America for you. Turn any historic moment into entertainment. The SEALs didn't just end a manhunt that night. They also opened a digital time capsule. Buried inside bin Laden's compound were hard drives and computers that revealed a side of him nobody expected. And when the CIA began digging through those files, the discoveries were as bizarre as they were disturbing. Osama bin Laden was a terrible person who did horrible things. So when CIA agents cracked open the hard drives they grabbed from his compound, nobody expected to find normal stuff. When they dug deeper into what was actually saved on those computers, some really strange files turned up. Turns out the world's most wanted terrorist was watching anime, playing video games, and checking out some of the nastier corners of the internet. Picture this monster sitting around in his hideout, browsing the web like some bored teenager. Get ready, because what investigators discovered on this terrorist's hard drive will shock and disgust anyone who sees it. May 2, 2011. Navy SEALs broke into Osama bin Laden's compound in Pakistan like they owned the place. This wasn't just any mission, this was the big one. 5 terrorists died that night, including bin Laden and one of his sons. The SEALs moved through that compound like a well-oiled machine, making sure to grab bin Laden's body before they left. Why take the corpse? Simple. They didn't want fanatics turning his grave into some twisted shrine, so they tossed him in the ocean later. Problem solved, but the real treasure wasn't the body, it was the computers. Hard drives, flash drives, laptops. The SEALs grabbed everything digital they could find, and boy were they in for a surprise. The CIA eventually released a bunch of this stuff to help people understand how Al-Qaeda worked. What nobody expected was the mountain of meme videos, knitting tutorials, and really weird porn choices scattered across those hard drives. Of course they kept the dangerous stuff locked away, intel about other terrorists and videos too nasty for public viewing. All told, they pulled 470,000 digital files totaling 250 gigabytes of data from bin Laden's digital life. Each file was stranger than the last. Finding terrorist stuff on a terrorist's computer shouldn't shock anyone, but the CIA did release one document that was pretty wild. An actual Al-Qaeda recruitment form, like something from a twisted HR department. Most recruitment forms ask about work experience and hobbies. This one had questions like, do you want to blow yourself up? Right next to what are your favorite pastimes? Talk about mixing business with pleasure. Nobody knows if answering yes to the suicide question got someone hired or fired from Terrorist Inc. But that wasn't all. The hard drives were packed with videos of bin Laden's son, Hamza. The kid was supposed to take over the family business when daddy couldn't terrorize people anymore. Al-Qaeda filmed him constantly, trying to make propaganda showing what a strong leader he'd be. Reality check, the videos told a different story. There was this hour-long wedding video that was duller than watching paint dry. Hamza looked miserable the whole time, sporting a sad little mustache and the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. The propaganda team had to edit the footage heavily to make him look remotely inspiring. Those videos probably helped the US track him down. In 2019, Hamza got killed in a counter-terrorism operation somewhere in Afghanistan or Pakistan. So much for the family legacy. The hard drives also had plans for the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and schemes to exploit the Arab Spring uprisings. Standard terrorist homework that wasn't meant for outside eyes. But the really shocking stuff had nothing to do with terrorism. Turns out bin Laden was completely obsessed with himself. His hard drives were stuffed with documentaries about his own life. Shows like CNN's In the Footsteps of Bin Laden and World's Most Wanted filled up his digital storage. Sure, maybe he downloaded them to see what American media knew about him. But if that was the only reason, why save them forever? It's not hard to picture this monster sitting in his compound, watching shows about himself and getting some sick thrill out of his own infamy. He even had Where in the World is Osama bin Laden, the 2008 documentary by Morgan Spurlock, the guy who made Super Size Me. Imagine being so self-absorbed that films making fun of your ability to hide become your entertainment. The weirdest documentary on bin Laden's hard drive was Loose Change, a conspiracy theory film claiming 9/11 was an inside job by the US government. This thing has been debunked more times than flat earth theories, but there it was, saved on the computer of the guy who actually planned the attacks. Why would the mastermind of 9/11 keep a movie claiming he didn't do it? Maybe he found it funny how gullible people could be. Or maybe he kept it like some twisted souvenir, along with all those other documentaries about himself. Bin Laden was paranoid, which made sense since every military force on Earth wanted him dead. But a document on his hard drive showed just how deep that paranoia ran. He sent messages to one of his wives claiming Iranian dentists had planted a tracking device in her tooth filling. He described this imaginary chip as the size of a grain of wheat with the width of a fine piece of pasta. The poor woman probably had to live with this delusion, and knowing bin Laden, he might have forced her to get the tooth removed. There's zero evidence such technology existed back then, but paranoid minds don't care about reality. The deeper someone digs into bin Laden's computer files, the weirder things get. His porn collection wasn't exactly normal stuff. The guy had some pretty strange tastes when it came to adult content. His hard drive was packed with bootleg copies of weird porn games from old arcades. Games like Fantasy 95 and Perestroika Girls gave players badly drawn naked anime girls as rewards for beating levels. The pictures were either blocky pixelated characters or grainy photos of real women that looked like they were taken with a potato. Not exactly premium material, but then again, bin Laden always had odd preferences. Some reporters think the pixelated porn served a darker purpose. Maybe he wasn't just getting his kicks. Maybe he was using it to send secret messages to other Al-Qaeda members. Email was too risky since it could be traced back to him. Hiding coded instructions inside porn files would be a pretty clever way to communicate without raising red flags. The US government would be looking for terrorist communications, not analyzing dirty pictures for hidden meanings. But other experts have a simpler explanation for all that pixelated porn on his computer. Sometimes the obvious answer is the right one. Maybe the world's most wanted terrorist just had terrible taste in adult entertainment. Even evil masterminds can have embarrassing browsing habits. Bin Laden's computer wasn't just full of weird porn. The guy had downloaded tons of other stuff that would make anyone scratch their head. Remember 2007 when YouTube was pumping out those silly meme videos? Well, even the world's most wanted man couldn't resist Charlie Bit My Finger. The CIA agents going through his files probably did a double take when they found that one. His hard drive was stuffed with cat videos too. Maybe bin Laden was a cat lover, or maybe he just needed something cute to watch between planning attacks. Either way, the man had serious feline content on his computer. But here's where things get really strange. Bin Laden had a massive collection of crocheting tutorials. Yes, crocheting. Files with names like How to Crochet a Basket and Stripe Crochet Beanie Cap Hat filled up space on his drives. Picture this, the leader of Al-Qaeda sitting in his hideout, needles clicking away as he follows along with YouTube tutorials. Maybe hiding from the world's most powerful military gets boring after a while. Someone in that compound was definitely getting crafty with yarn, and the evidence points to some serious knitting happening between terrorist meetings. The strangest part of bin Laden's digital stash wasn't the games or the pirated movies, it was the kids' stuff. His hard drive looked like it belonged to a preschool teacher. Littered among the files were names like Twinkle Twinkle, Little Star, Maybe. Arabic and English use completely different alphabets, but apparently he thought cartoon nursery rhymes were the way to sharpen his skills. The image of the world's most infamous terrorist sitting in his secret hideout, listening to animated kids sing about the ABCs, is surreal. Then again, almost everything about his digital footprint was. And it wasn't just children's jingles. His folders also contained a lineup of random documentaries that raised eyebrows. One was titled Sex Crimes in the Vatican, which sounds like he was either digging for religious scandals to exploit, or just had a taste for controversy. Another was How Many Angels Are There?, which could have been about theology, mysticism, or maybe just some obscure YouTube rant about angel head counts in holy texts. Nobody knows. Bin Laden's media diet was like a bizarre mixtape, part kindergarten, part scandal, part religious trivia. Whatever the purpose, it left investigators scratching their heads, wondering how a man so terrifying could also have the digital habits of a bored dad fumbling with YouTube autoplay. Bin Laden apparently loved his cartoons. Tom and Jerry episodes and Pink Panther shows took up space on his drives. But the most mysterious file had to be bubbles.wmv. Was this literally just footage of someone blowing bubbles? A how-to guide for making soap bubbles? The world may never know what made this video worth keeping. The real surprise was how much anime filled those hard drives. Someone in that compound was a serious anime fan, and they weren't messing around. Naruto, Bleach and Dragon Ball Z episodes were stacked up like a teenager's download folder. They even had the Devil May Cry and obscure anime crossovers that only hardcore fans would recognize. The sheer amount of pirated anime shows just how much time Al-Qaeda spent illegally downloading entertainment. Copyright lawyers probably weren't their biggest worry, but someone put serious effort into building this collection. Whether Bin Laden ordered the anime downloads or some terrorist took it upon themselves to become the compound's entertainment manager, those files got watched regularly. For someone who hated Western culture, Bin Laden sure loved Hollywood movies. His drives held animated flicks like Ants, Cars, Ice Age and Chicken Little. Action movies were there too, Resident Evil, The Three Musketeers and Batman Gotham Knight. Maybe he told himself it was research, but it looks more like movie night happened pretty often in that hideout. Life in hiding gets painfully monotonous when drones are circling overhead, satellites are watching every square of Earth, and the most elite soldiers in the world are hunting for your compound. Bin Laden needed distractions, and like a teenager stuck in his bedroom, he turned to video games. His hard drive showed a surprising obsession with Nintendo titles, running emulators so he could play the kinds of games that most people grew up with. Mario and Luigi, Partners in Time, New Super Mario Bros., Metroid Prime Hunters, and Yoshi's Island DS, bright, colourful, family-friendly adventures. Imagine the world's most wanted terrorist hunched over a controller, stomping on Goombas while the CIA devoted billions to finding him. The contrast is absurd, like Darth Vader secretly binging on Animal Crossing. But it wasn't all cartoon plumbers and bouncing Yoshis. On his drive sat Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars, a game that felt uncomfortably on-brand. Stealing cars, outrunning cops, causing chaos, it was practically a digital reflection of his real life, minus the joystick. You can almost picture him staying up late, locked inside the compound, practicing escapes from virtual police, while, outside, real intelligence teams closed in with satellites, wiretaps and surveillance drones. The thought of Bin Laden button-mashing through fake crime sprees is bizarrely funny, but the irony cut short in May 2011. In the end, there were no cheat codes, no restarts, and no second lives. SEAL Team 6 kicked down the door, and the man who tried to escape the world through games learned there's no reset button in reality. His controller went silent for good, and the world, at long last, became safer. Another game on Bin Laden's computer makes perfect sense when thinking about his day job. Counter-Strike was right there on his hard drive, a shooting game where players choose between terrorists planting bombs or counter-terrorists stopping them. Take a wild guess which team Bin Laden and his buddies preferred. This game usually needs internet to play against people worldwide, but the compound crew probably set up their own private network to battle each other, way more secure than going online where someone might track them down. So if anyone played Counter-Strike back then, they probably never faced off against actual terrorists, though nobody knows for sure. The gaming collection had other time killers too. Zuma Deluxe was there for when they wanted something different. Back in 2007, those puzzle games were huge hits. Bin Laden's group stayed pretty current with their gaming choices, which is kind of impressive for people living in isolation. They also spent time shooting zombies in Sniper Elite Nazi Zombie Army 2. Most of their games involved guns and violence, which isn't shocking given their hobbies. But they still enjoyed Mario just as much as the bloody shooters. The files suggest Bin Laden was quite the gamer, even if nobody knows which games he personally preferred. Gaming and weird porn weren't the only things buried on those drives. Alongside the bizarre collection of cartoons and clickbait clips sat gigabytes of documents, some released to the public, many more still locked away by intelligence agencies. The ones the world didn't get to see almost certainly played a role in tracking, capturing, or killing other al-Qaeda operatives in the months and years after the raid. In a way, Bin Laden's hard drive became one of the most valuable intelligence jackpots in modern history. But not all the files were about operational secrets. Investigators believe the drives also held gruesome media, photographs and videos of torture, propaganda reels, and executions meant for internal use. These weren't meant for public eyes. The FBI and CIA weren't about to upload those to the internet for transparency. So while the headlines joked about Final Fantasy VII saves and YouTube memes, the darker truth sat just beneath the surface. This was still the digital footprint of a terrorist empire. Having the same games and movies as everyday people didn't make Bin Laden relatable. He wasn't average. He was still the man who masterminded the deaths of thousands. The silly entertainment choices only highlighted the bizarre contradiction between his normal human habits and his monstrous legacy. Then there were the email drafts. Since Bin Laden couldn't risk using phones or an internet connection, knowing full well satellites and NSA ears would zero in on him in minutes, he relied on old-fashioned human couriers. He typed drafts on a computer, saved them onto USB sticks, and handed them off to trusted messengers. These couriers would sneak out of the compound, find an internet cafe, and send the emails from there. Replies came back the same way, slow, risky, and inefficient, but effective enough to keep al-Qaeda's command structure alive. And that was the real surprise. Even while locked inside a compound without so much as a working Wi-Fi signal, Bin Laden still micromanaged terror. He wasn't just hiding, he was actively leading. Files showed him issuing orders, approving missions, reading detailed reports, and handing down religious rulings like some twisted CEO of violence. Sure, his deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri carried more weight in day-to-day operations, but the retired Bin Laden was far from retired. He remained busy, plotting, and very much in charge, running evil from isolation. SEAL Team 6 grabbed tons of information during their raid while taking out Bin Laden. Several people lived at that compound. At least a few wives and several children were there during the operation. This raises an important point about those hard drives. Even though the drives came from Bin Laden's compound, other family members or guards might have used them too. So not every movie, show, game, or adult video necessarily belonged to Bin Laden personally. But he almost certainly knew what was stored on those computers, and most of the entertainment was probably for his own use and boredom relief. The compound had more than just digital stuff. Bin Laden owned an interesting book collection that gave insights into his twisted mind. Surprisingly, several books focused on the United States. He studied American diplomacy tactics through titles like Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars, Noam Chomsky's Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies, and Robert Hopkins Miller's The US and Vietnam, 1787 to 1941. These readings helped Bin Laden understand his enemy and plan new ways to terrorize free people. The man did his homework when it came to plotting against America and the Western world. Here's the weird part. If Bin Laden hated America and the West so much, why was his hard drive overflowing with Western entertainment? Not just a little, but hours and hours of it. Movies, TV shows, children's cartoons, even the kind of YouTube clips you'd expect to see in some college dorm circa 2. Maybe, as some have suggested, consuming American media helped him study his enemy, know their humor, their trends, their weaknesses. Or maybe the guy simply liked watching Chicken Little and cracking up at Charlie Bit My Finger, like millions of others did at the time. The truth is probably somewhere in between, part strategy, part guilty pleasure. But really, trying to unpack Bin Laden's mind is like trying to solve a riddle written by a madman. You can try, but the contradictions will only lead you in circles. This was a man responsible for countless deaths, yet who also spent late nights watching pixelated adult videos and crocheting tutorials. The picture painted is less that of some mythical supervillain, and more of a deeply deranged hypocrite with very human, if bizarre, quirks. Like many monsters in history, bin Laden had his odd fascinations. He was a narcissistic psychopath, yet couldn't keep himself from consuming the same Western culture he declared war on. That's the bottom line. His drives contained plenty of material you'd expect from a terrorist mastermind, and plenty more that nobody ever would. Either way, the contradictions don't matter much now. The world became a lot safer the moment bin Laden stopped breathing. Thank goodness for SEAL Team 6, their night raid, and their deadly perfect aim. The files on bin Laden's hard drive were bizarre, unsettling, and in some cases almost unbelievable, a glimpse into the hidden life of one of history's most infamous figures. But not every shocking story comes from war or espionage. Sometimes the most jaw-dropping moments happen live, in front of millions of viewers, when things go terribly wrong, and that's exactly what happened in some of the worst winter sports accidents ever broadcast on TV. Winter sports look fun from the outside. People glide down mountains like they're dancing with gravity. But here's the thing nobody talks about at the ski lodge. These activities can go from thrilling to deadly in seconds flat. Skiing, snowboarding and luge aren't just weekend hobbies. They're high-speed games where ice becomes the enemy and trees don't move out of the way. One wrong turn, one patch of black ice, one moment of overconfidence, and what started as a perfect powder day becomes front-page news. The mountains don't care about experience levels or safety gear. They've claimed beginners and Olympic champions alike. These aren't just statistics or unfortunate mishaps. They're reminders that nature always holds the winning hand. The stories ahead reveal how quickly paradise can become perilous when humans meet mountains at breakneck speeds. March 25th, 2021. Daniel Andre Tande stands at the top of a ski jump, wind whipping around him. This isn't his first rodeo. The guy already snagged Olympic gold in 2018. But here's the brutal truth about ski jumping. It doesn't care about medals or experience. 1 second of bad luck can erase years of training. The warm-up run starts normal enough. Daniel rockets down the ramp and launches into the air at 62 mph. For a moment he's flying. Somehow they do. A helicopter whisks him to the hospital where he slips into a coma. But here's where the story gets weird. A week later he walks out of that hospital. 8 months after nearly dying on live television, he wins the 2022 World Cup. Sometimes the mountain gives people back. Then physics decides to play a cruel joke. Mid-flight, something snaps. His body starts spinning like a broken toy, completely out of control. The landing is horrific. He slams into the ground back first and slides 650 feet down the slope like a rag doll. His collarbone snaps. A lung gets punctured. Worse yet, his heart stops beating for 4 entire minutes. 4 minutes of clinical death while medics work frantically to bring him back. Garrett Bartelt wasn't the kind of skier who stuck to the safe side of the mountain. While most people were content carving turns on neat, groomed runs, Garrett hunted chaos. Steeper, sharper, riskier. That's where he felt alive. It was 1992 at the World Extreme Skiing Championships in Alaska, back when extreme skiing was still carving out its identity. No GoPros, no Red Bull sponsorships, just fearless athletes pointing themselves at gravity and hoping for the best. At 27 years old, Garrett had fought his way into the semi-finals, standing atop a peak that looked more like a cliff than a ski run. He didn't wear a helmet, few did back then, partly because safety gear was clunky, but also because many thought it ruined the look. What he did wear was confidence, and he aimed himself at a brutal 55-degree slope littered with jagged rock outcrops. Most pros would have scouted that line and walked away. Garrett dropped in. It went bad almost instantly. One misstep sent him spiraling, and gravity did the rest. He tumbled nearly 3,000 vertical feet, his body ricocheting off rocks, arms and skis flailing as if he'd been shot out of a cannon. 37 seconds of chaos. Commentators could only stammer through the horror, one even blurting, "You okay, dude?" as Garrett ragdolled down the face of the mountain like a pinball hitting every bumper. 800 feet of violent, bone-jarring cartwheels later, he finally came to a stop. Against all odds, he was conscious. Not only conscious, he was talking, joking even. His leg was clearly broken, but he laughed it off as rescuers scrambled toward him. The man had never been in a hospital before, never even broken a bone, and now here he was, setting a record not for skiing, but for surviving one of the ugliest falls ever broadcast. The craziest part? Most people would have hung up their skis forever after that. Garrett didn't. Once he healed, he went right back to extreme skiing. For him, mountains weren't enemies, they were challenges, and he wasn't about to let one win. January 29th, 1994. Ulrike Meier should have been thinking about the Olympics, they were just 2 weeks away. Instead, she was focused on the Women's World Cup race in Germany, broadcast live to fans worldwide. Among those watching was her 4-year-old daughter. Ulrike was royalty in alpine racing, 2-time Super G champion, world-class technique, the kind of skier who made difficult runs look effortless. As she pushed off at the starting line, everything looked perfect. Her form was flawless, her speed building steadily. The upper sections went exactly as planned. She hit 65 mile/per, flowing through gates like water. 20 seconds from the finish line, close enough to taste victory. That's when her right ski found soft snow and caught an edge. Control vanished instantly. Her body launched off course and smashed into a pile of snow at full speed. The helmet couldn't save her neck from snapping on impact. Live television captured everything: her fall, the immediate silence, the frantic medical response. A helicopter rushed her to the hospital, but some injuries don't heal. Her daughter had watched her mother's final race without knowing it. The skiing world lost one of its brightest stars just days before she was supposed to shine at the Olympics. March 10th, 2012. Grindelwald, Switzerland. Nick Zoricic was living the dream, representing Canada in ski cross, one of skiing's most dangerous events. Think NASCAR on snow, with multiple racers flying down courses packed with jumps and sharp turns. Nick knew the risks. He'd placed second in the 2011 World Cup, so this wasn't amateur hour. The course was familiar territory, the kind of challenge he'd conquered dozens of times before. Fans were cheering, cameras were rolling, everything felt routine. The race started clean. Nick stayed competitive through the upper sections, trailing slightly, but within striking distance. At 60 malaprios, he approached the final jump, a feature he'd cleared countless times in practice. But skiing has a way of punishing overconfidence. The takeoff went wrong. Instead of landing in the designated zone, Nick flew to the right and crashed into safety netting at devastating speed. The impact was immediately catastrophic. Spectators didn't grasp what they'd witnessed until medical teams swarmed the scene. At 29, Nick's career and life ended on live television. His family later started the Nick Zoricic Foundation, convinced his death could have been prevented. The police called it a standard sporting accident, but his loved ones knew better. Sometimes safety nets aren't enough to catch falling dreams. This was supposed to be routine practice, nothing more than fine-tuning tricks she'd done thousands of times. Mid-routine, something shifted. Sarah flipped in the air and landed headfirst on the pipe. At first glance, it looked like another minor wipeout. She was conscious, moving, talking. No big deal in a sport where crashes happen daily. But seconds later, her heart stopped beating. The head impact had torn her vertebral artery. Blood and oxygen stopped flowing to her brain. Emergency crews rushed her to University Hospital in Salt Lake City, where doctors placed her in a medically induced coma. 9 days later, on January 19th, Sarah Burke died from what seemed like such a small mistake. During the 2014 Olympics, the games where her sport finally debuted, her ashes were scattered in the Sochi halfpipe. Her former coach spread them as a tribute. Sarah had made it to the Olympics after all, just not how anyone imagined. Sarah Burke owned freestyle skiing, 5 Winter X Games gold medals, World Championship winner. She'd even convinced Olympic officials to include halfpipe skiing in the 2014 Games. At the peak of her career, the only thing missing was Olympic gold, a prize that seemed guaranteed. January 10th, 2012. Park City Mountain Resort, Utah. Sarah was training on the Superpipe, that massive U-shaped structure where freestyle skiers perform aerial magic. Christmas 1990. Gernot Reinstadler smiles in this photo, just weeks before suffering one of skiing's most horrific deaths. Born in Austria in 1970, he was the future of downhill racing, young, talented, fearless, junior World Cup competitor, 3-time Austrian Junior Cup medalist. His career trajectory pointed straight up. January 18, 1991, the Lauberhorn qualification race in Switzerland, skiing's longest and fastest downhill course, 3 miles of pure terror, where racers hit 100+ mil/s. Only the 30 fastest would make the main event. Gernot, starting as number 44, was pumped beyond reason. His teammate Andreas Scherer almost warned him about being too aggressive during warm-up, but held back. Young athletes need confidence, not caution. Big mistake. For 2.5 minutes, Gernot flew down the course flawlessly. Victory seemed inevitable. Then, meters from the finish line, he lost control and slammed into the safety nets at full speed. But instead of stopping him, the netting became a torture device. His ski caught in the mesh while his body kept moving. The force nearly tore him in half, splitting his pelvis in ways that shouldn't be possible. The white snow turned red instantly. Emergency surgery lasted 6 hours with multiple blood transfusions, but some injuries can't be fixed. Gernot died just after midnight on January 9. The 1991 Lauberhorn race was cancelled in his honor, and safety nets were completely redesigned. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to prevent the next one. Mount Everest kills 4.4 climbers every year on average. For most people, that statistic would be enough to stay home. For Marco Siffredi, it was just another challenge to overcome while snowboarding back down. This French snowboarder and mountaineer had a simple philosophy: climb up, ride down. In 1996, barely a year after learning to snowboard, he was already tackling impossible descents. His first big ride was down the Mallory route on Aiguille du Midi, 3,300 feet of 55-degree terror. 3,280 feet of up to 60-degree slopes that cemented his reputation among extreme snowboarders worldwide. But even this wasn't enough. Marco wanted the ultimate prize, Mount Everest. Not just to climb it like thousands of others, but to be the first person to snowboard down continuously from the summit. On May 23, 2001, the day after his birthday, he stood ready to attempt the impossible. Success bred ambition. By season's end, he'd completed the first snowboard descent of Mountain Chardonnay, again choosing routes that would make sane people reconsider their life choices. His friend Philippe helped with that descent, but later died in an avalanche. Marco's brother Pierre met the same fate. Most people would take these deaths as warnings. Marco took them as motivation to go bigger. 1999 brought his masterpiece, the first snowboard descent of Mont Blanc via the Aiguille route. Standing on top of the world, Marco faced his first major problem. The route he'd planned, the Hornbeam Couloir, his personal holy grail, didn't have enough snow. Even for someone with his death wish, attempting it would be stupid. Worse news, he wasn't alone in this crazy quest. Austrian climber Stefan Gatt had reached the summit the day before and started his own snowboard descent. Stefan stopped halfway down due to hard snow conditions, but his partial success meant Marco needed a complete descent to claim the first ever title. Plan B, the Norton Couloir. More snow, still deadly, but at least possible. Marco started his descent with 2 Sherpas watching nervously. 600 feet down, his binding strap snapped from the cold. Suddenly his boot wasn't properly attached to his snowboard, a recipe for disaster at 28,000 feet. One of the Sherpas improvised a repair using whatever they had. MacGyver would have been proud. The fix held, and Marco continued his descent, over 11,000 feet of 40 to 45 degree slopes, arriving at base camp just 4 hours after standing on Earth's highest point. News spread through the snowboarding world like wildfire. Marco Siffredi had become the first person to complete a continuous snowboard descent of Mount Everest. Mission accomplished, career made, legacy secured. But this wouldn't be the end of Marco's story. Success has a way of demanding bigger and bigger risks. Sometimes the mountain gives people back, and sometimes it doesn't. One successful Everest descent wasn't enough for Marco. The Hornbeam Couloir still called to him, that perfect route he'd been forced to skip the first time. September 8, 2002 became his target date for redemption. August 14th found him back at base camp, telescope in hand, scanning the mountain for snow conditions. What he saw looked promising, enough powder to make his dream descent possible. The confidence boost was exactly what he needed to commit to another death-defying adventure. The second attempt started differently than the first. Weather turned brutal almost immediately. Snowstorms hammered the north face while avalanches swept through regularly. The Sherpas worked overtime fixing ropes and hauling gear through conditions that would send most climbers home. Camp 1 at 21,000 feet brought Marco's first warning sign, headaches that hadn't bothered him before. His body was telling him something, but he pushed forward anyway. Camp 2 arrived with more of the same, storms, ice, and physical discomfort growing stronger. Camp 3 marked entry into the death zone, where human bodies start breaking down faster than they can recover. Marco felt every foot of altitude this time. His entire body ached constantly. The storms made snowboarding look impossible, even for someone with his skills. Then his meteorologist delivered good news over the satellite phone. A brief weather window was opening on September 8th. just enough time to attempt the Hornbein couloir descent he'd dreamed about for over a year. At 1:30 a.m. on September 8th, Marco and his team left camp in darkness, breaking through chest-deep snow toward the summit. 12.5 hours later, at 2:10 p.m., they stood on top of the world again. Marco was exhausted beyond measure. Tired, too much snow, too much climbing, he told the Sherpas. But his determination burned brighter than his fatigue. He changed oxygen bottles, strapped on his pack, and prepared for the descent he'd been planning for months. Then the clouds rolled in. The weather window was closing fast. The Sherpas urged him to wait, to try another day when conditions improved. One mistake at this altitude would be permanent, they warned. But Marco had spent a year preparing for this exact moment. Another chance might never come. "Take care, Marco," said one of the Sherpas. "Okay, Pemba, see you tomorrow," Marco replied, already focused on the slope below. He carved a few turns into the world's highest snow, paused to assess the route, then headed toward the Hornbein couloir. 50 minutes later, at 3:15 p.m., he vanished into the clouds. The Sherpas watched from above until he disappeared completely. As they began their own descent, they spotted something unsettling, a figure standing briefly before sliding silently down the mountain. Since only their team and Marco were supposed to be in that area, the implications were chilling. When they reached base camp, they found no snowboard tracks, no gear, no sign of Marco anywhere. He had simply disappeared into the mountain that had given him his greatest triumph just 1 year earlier. A month later, his family and friends held a memorial service at Everest Base Camp. His body was never recovered. Nobody knows exactly what happened during those final moments of his descent. Luge might look simple from the outside, just people lying on tiny sleds sliding down icy tracks. But simple doesn't mean safe. Athletes hit 80-90 mph while steering with nothing but subtle body movements. One wrong twitch can turn a sled into a missile. The 2010 Winter Olympics in Canada brought together the world's best luge athletes, including 21-year-old Nodar Kumaritashvili from Georgia. Luge ran in his family. His grandfather had introduced the sport to Soviet Georgia, and both his father and uncle had competed before him. Nodar represented more than just personal ambition. He carried the hopes of a small nation making its mark on the world stage. His training had been intense, his preparation thorough. Everything seemed aligned for a successful Olympic debut. But the Whistler Sliding Center, where he'd be competing already, had a reputation for trouble. The 2006 Olympic tracks had produced multiple serious crashes, putting pressure on organizers to improve safety measures. During testing, however, luge speeds exceeded design calculations by 6 mph, reaching 95 mph, faster than anyone had anticipated. Luge Federation President Joseph Fent expressed public concerns about athlete safety. "The track's fast, it certainly is. Athletes definitely have to be on their game from turn 11 down. Future track designs need to account for these speeds." Despite these warnings, the Vancouver Olympic Committee declared the track safe for competition. That decision would prove tragically wrong within hours of the game's opening ceremony. February 12, 2010. Hours before the Olympic opening ceremony, Nodar was completing his final practice run at Whistler. 25 training attempts were already behind him. This would be number 26, his last chance to fine-tune his technique before competition began. The run started normally. Nodar launched himself onto the sled with practiced ease, navigating the first turns smoothly while building speed. Spectators and coaches watched without concern. Everything looked routine for an athlete of his caliber. Turn after turn, his speed increased beyond anything he'd experienced before. The track was living up to its reputation as the fastest in Olympic history. Still, Nodar maintained control through the technical middle sections, demonstrating the skills that had earned him a spot on the Georgian Olympic team. Then came the final turn. Something went wrong, whether it was a steering error, equipment failure, or simply too much speed for human reflexes to handle. Nodar lost control completely and was thrown off his luge at 89 mph. He flew over the track's edge and slammed into an unpadded steel support pole. The impact was immediately fatal. No helmet, no padding, no safety barrier could have absorbed that kind of force. Medical teams rushed to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR, then transported him to the nearest hospital. But the damage was too severe. Nodar became Luge's first fatality since 1975, just hours before the Olympics were supposed to celebrate athletic achievement. News of his death shocked Georgia and the entire Olympic community. The Georgian team considered withdrawing completely but ultimately decided to stay and dedicate their performances to their fallen teammate. One athlete did return home for the funeral, while the rest wore black armbands and helmet stripes in Nodar's honor. The opening ceremony proceeded, but the shadow of tragedy hung over the entire Games. Sometimes the pursuit of Olympic glory demands a price too high to pay. The crashes on live television were brutal, sudden moments where everything went wrong in front of the world's eyes. But as horrifying as those accidents were, nothing compares to what happens when disaster strikes far from cameras, out on the open sea, where survival pushes people to their breaking point. That's the story of one of the most disturbing mutinies and shipwrecks in history. October 1628. A Dutch merchant ship packed with gold and precious stones left port, heading for the spice markets of Indonesia. The captain thought storms and wild seas would be his biggest problem. He was wrong. Dead wrong. Something dark was already stirring below deck. Something that would kill most of the 300 souls on board. The lucky ones died fast. The others? They faced something much worse than drowning. This is what really happened to them. Fair warning, it gets ugly. September 1629. Captain Francisco Pelsa was losing his mind somewhere off Western Australia. For a whole month, he and his ship Sardam had been playing hide and seek with one tiny island in a chain of 122 others. Problem was, they all looked identical, just sad dots of sand pretending to be land. The Houtman-Abrolhos Islands were basically nature's cruel joke. Most were nothing more than glorified sandcastles that barely poked above the waterline. Francisco desperately needed Beacon Island, but navigation in 1629 was like trying to find your keys in the dark while blindfolded. No GPS, no satellites, no clue. Ships used something called dead reckoning, essentially educated guessing with a compass. Estimate where they were, then guess where they were going based on that first guess. Small mistakes turned into big problems fast. A few degrees off course could put them miles from their target. It's exactly how Francisco got stuck in this mess to begin with. After weeks of sailing in circles like a lost tourist, the Sardam crew was basically making random passes around where they thought Beacon Island might be hiding. Mostly they found more endless ocean. Then one day, Francisco spotted something promising in the distance. Smoke rising from an island dead ahead. The Sardam crept as close as possible before dropping anchor. Francisco took a small rowboat to shore, expecting to find whoever was making that smoke. The beach was empty. No fire, no people, no explanation. Just as he turned to leave, another boat came racing toward shore. 4 men paddling like death was chasing them. One jumped out and splashed through knee-deep water onto dry land, shouting something Francisco couldn't understand. When the man got closer, and Francisco finally made out the words, his blood turned to ice. What he was about to learn would send him racing back to his ship in absolute terror. The 28th of October, 1628. Almost a year before Francisco's nightmare discovery, he had led 8 Dutch East India Company ships away from Texel Island. The VOC owned the spice trade back then, literally owned it. Their destination, Batavia, the spice capital of the world. Today we call it Jakarta. The flagship was called Batavia too. Francisco commanded over 300 souls crammed aboard, crew, soldiers, and rich passengers. Many were wives heading to reunite with husbands who'd struck it rich in the spice business. The ship was brand new, 150 feet of floating wood bristling with 24 cannons. Not a warship, mind you. Just a really well-armed grocery store. Hidden in the cargo hold sat 12 chests, stuffed with gold, silver, and gems. Trade bait for mountains of spices that would make everyone filthy rich back home. The Dutch had turned spice trading into an art form. The route around Africa into the Indian Ocean was familiar but still wanted to kill them. Warm waters bred typhoons like angry gods. Sailing east meant fighting headwinds the whole way. Between the weather trying to drown them and navigation that was basically throwing darts blindfolded, the VOC sent fleets instead of single ships. More cargo space, better survival odds. Or so they thought. This trip went sideways before it even started. Storms hit the fleet while they were still in the North Sea, splitting the group like a bad divorce. Only 3 ships made it out. Francisco watched 5 vessels disappear into the grey, along with most of their cargo capacity. But weather was just the appetizer. The real problem was the VOC's brilliant command structure. Every ship got its own captain, including the flagship. But the fleet commander couldn't captain his own ship, so the Batavia had Francisco as fleet boss and Ariane Jacobs as ship captain. 2 alphas, 1 boat. What could go wrong? These two had history too. 2 years back, Ariane got drunk and decided to trash-talk Francisco in front of the crew. Francisco didn't appreciate being roasted by his own man. When they got home, he publicly humiliated Ariane as payback. Now, they were stuck together on a ship, heading into unknown waters with a skeleton fleet. Neither trusted the other. Both needed each other to survive. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Francisco's suspicion was about to prove deadly accurate. Francisco's gut feeling about Ariane was spot on. While Francisco worried about storms and navigation, Ariane was busy plotting a mutiny with junior merchant Geronimus Cornelis. Geronimus wasn't even a sailor, just a high-ranking VOC official who somehow became Ariane's right-hand man. Nobody's quite sure why Geronimus was on the ship at all. Rumors said he was running from arrest for weird religious beliefs. The guy was obsessed with some painter who claimed dead spirits helped him create art. When the painter got locked up for heresy, Geronimus saw him as a hero. Geronimus didn't hide his crazy beliefs either. He used them like a recruitment tool, finding other passengers who shared his twisted worldview. But his plan went way beyond just taking over the ship. Geronimus wanted to sail somewhere remote and start his own little kingdom with himself as king. So while Francisco worried about reaching Batavia alive, Geronimus spent his time building an army of mutineers ready to make his sick fantasy come true. The ship was carrying more than gold and spices. It was carrying the seeds of its own destruction. Fair warning, this is where things get really ugly. Geronimus and Ariane cooked up a sick plan. They'd get some crew members to assault one of the rich married women on board. The idea was to get caught, then convince everyone that Francisco's punishment was too harsh. Classic manipulation to spark a mutiny. The Batavia docked at Cape of Good Hope near Cape Town for supplies. As soon as they left, the plan kicked into action. The volunteer scumbag went below deck to attack a 7-year-old woman they'd picked out. But the dark hallways worked against them. She couldn't see who did it. When she couldn't identify her attackers later, the whole thing got swept under the rug. Just like that. No justice, no consequences. The plan failed, but the real horror was how easily violence against women got ignored. Even worse, Francisco had no clue about any of this. He was actually celebrating. They'd reached Cape of Good Hope a full month ahead of schedule. After that rough start, months of smooth sailing around, Africa had him feeling optimistic. That good luck was about to run out fast. A storm hit right after they entered the Indian Ocean, scattering their last 3 ships. When the weather cleared, the Batavia was completely alone. Francisco realized they'd have to cross the entire Indian Ocean by themselves. Clock was ticking before they reached their destination. Ariane and Geronimus needed Plan B, and fast. When Ariane ordered the ship away from Cape of Good Hope, he quietly steered them off course. No fancy instruments to catch him, Francisco was flying blind again. The 4th of June, 1629. Early morning hours. Francisco was sleeping peacefully in his bunk when the Batavia suddenly slammed to a violent stop with a sound like the world ending. Wrecking the ship wasn't part of the plan. Ariane and Geronimus wanted to make Francisco look like an idiot commander, or buy time for a better scheme. What actually happened was Ariane screwing up his navigation so badly that the ship crashed straight into Morning Reef, just off Western Australia in the Houtman Abrolhos Islands. The crash punched holes in the hull. Crew, soldiers and passengers got sucked into the ocean through the cracks. Gone forever. These were just the first deaths of many to come. The Batavia was toast, damaged beyond any hope of repair. Its first voyage would be its last. Chaos. Longboats hit the water immediately. Crew started ferrying people to an island northwest of the wreck. By sunrise, around 180 survivors were on Beacon Island, including 30 women and children, who were relatively safe for now. Francisco ordered search parties for water and food while others salvaged what they could from the sinking ship. The haul was pathetic, a few barrels of hardtack biscuits and some water. That was it. Death toll from the crash, somewhere between 30 and 50 people. A handful of biscuits and water wouldn't keep nearly 300 survivors alive for long. Beacon Island wasn't going to save them either. Calling it an island was generous, more like a sand pile with an attitude. 13 acres of sand and scrubby plants. Sure, it was part of a 122-island chain about 50 miles from mainland Australia, but most of those islands were just as useless. Francisco had to move fast or everyone would starve. He huddled with his senior officers and came up with a desperate plan. Take one of the longboats to mainland Australia and see if survival there looked any better. Next night, Francisco loaded 48 people into a longboat, including Ariane, and headed back into the Indian Ocean toward Australia. The trip went smooth enough. Francisco organized search parties as soon as they hit shore. Hours of searching revealed the obvious. Mainland Australia was just as hostile as the island. Francisco faced an impossible choice. Return to Beacon Island empty-handed and regroup, or point the longboat north toward Batavia, over 1,800 miles through open ocean, and pray. Problem was, their longboat was basically a glorified rowboat. Low to the water, no protection from weather, designed only to get people from a sinking ship to somewhere less sinky. Long ocean voyages? Not in the design specs. But going back to Beacon Island without supplies meant everyone dies anyway. Dehydration, starvation, take their pick. At least if they tried for Indonesia and failed, they'd die trying to save everyone instead of just waiting around for death to show up. Francisco made his choice. Indonesia or bust. Days after the crash, the Batavia finally gave up and broke apart completely. The ship had been slowly dying since hitting Morning Reef, groaning and creaking like a wounded animal. When it finally went down, the wreck sucked down another 40 people as it sank into the depths. Bodies, dreams, and hopes, all disappearing beneath the waves together. Geronimus somehow managed to avoid becoming fish food. Lucky him. Or unlucky for everyone else, depending how you look at it. By then, the survivors were getting bitter and desperate. Francisco had never mentioned that sailing to Batavia might be an option when he left with nearly 50 men. Even though he was actually trying to save them by seeking rescue, it felt like complete abandonment to the people left behind. Fear and resentment were spreading through the camp like infection, poisoning whatever unity they'd managed to maintain. The psychological pressure was crushing. Stuck on a barren island with dwindling supplies, no clear leadership, and no idea if help was coming. People started looking for someone to blame, someone to follow, someone who might have answers in a situation where there weren't any good ones. Geronimus saw his golden opportunity in all this chaos and despair. With Francisco and Ariane gone, why not elect a new leader? Someone who understood their desperate situation. Someone who seemed to care about their survival. Someone who talked a good game about making the hard decisions that Francisco had been too weak to make. His campaign was masterful manipulation. He positioned himself as the practical choice, the man willing to do whatever it took to keep people alive. He promised fair distribution of resources, better organization, and most importantly, hope for rescue. When the votes were counted, Geronimus won in a landslide. The desperate survivors had just elected their own executioner to lead them, and they had absolutely no idea how badly they'd screwed up. Democracy had just committed suicide. First thing Geronimus did as leader? Grab all the weapons, food, boats, and rafts. Classic dictator move straight from the playbook. Consolidate power, control resources, eliminate opposition. He moved fast while people were still celebrating their new leadership and feeling hopeful about their chances. Next came the fun part, divide and conquer. He was outnumbered badly, around 250 survivors versus his handful of loyal psychopaths who'd been planning this takeover for months. Time to thin the herd systematically and strategically. His plan was elegantly simple and absolutely ruthless. Cut the population from 250 down to 120. Nice, manageable number that his small crew of killers could actually control. The math was brutal, but the logic was sound from a sociopath's perspective. He started by sending 45 people to Seal Island, about a mile away and clearly visible from Beacon Island. Men, women, cabin boys didn't matter to him. All just numbers to be subtracted from his problem. He told them to search for resources, maybe find fresh water or food sources that could help everyone survive longer. What he didn't mention was that he had zero intention of bringing them back. Ever. They were being sent to die slowly of thirst and starvation, far enough away that their screams wouldn't carry back to disturb the remaining survivors. Next, he convinced the soldiers, led by a tough guy named Weber Hayes, to sail to West Wallaby Island, about 5.5 miles out. Their mission sounded reasonable: find stuff that might help, maybe freshwater sources or edible plants. If they found anything useful, send up smoke signals for pickup. What Geronimus actually planned was way darker and more calculated. If he saw those smoke signals indicating the soldiers had found resources, he'd send his killers to West Wallaby Island to murder every single one of the unarmed soldiers. Can't have armed, organized men finding resources and potentially becoming a threat to his rule. That's assuming the soldiers even made it to the island alive in the first place. Geronimus figured Francisco and his crew probably drowned in rough seas after leaving the main group. Maybe the soldiers would get the same treatment from Mother Nature, saving him the trouble of killing them himself. Sometimes the ocean does a dictator's dirty work for free. Things got worse. Much, much worse. Geronimus kept sending survivors on various island missions at first, maintaining the pretense that he was trying to help everyone survive through organized exploration and resource gathering. But eventually, he dropped the pretense entirely. His men would just take people out to sea in small boats and shove them overboard once they were far enough from shore that no one could swim back. Simple, efficient, terrifying. No more elaborate excuses or fake missions. Just straight-up murder disguised as boat rides. Once he cleared out the biggest threats from Beacon Island, the strong men who might organize resistance, the smart people who might see through his lies, the natural leaders who might challenge his authority, the mask came off completely. Geronimus transformed from elected leader into judge, jury, and executioner, rolled into one twisted, power-drunk package. He picked who lived and who died based on pure whim and personal preference. The wives who'd been traveling to reunite with their husbands in the spice trade, now they belonged to him as personal property to do with as he pleased. No consent required in his new kingdom. The sick and disabled got eliminated first. No point keeping dead weight around when resources were limited. Cold calculation disguised as practical survival decisions. For stronger survivors who might be useful later, Geronimus ordered nighttime raids that turned sleep into a luxury no one could afford. His men would creep into the camp like death itself and kill people while they slept. Throats cut, skulls bashed in, bodies dragged away before dawn. At least 2 mass graves got dug during this reign of terror, bodies piled on top of each other like cordwood. One grave held an entire family, including 6 children whose only crime was being born to parents Geronimus didn't like. Despite all his power and cruelty, despite controlling life and death with a gesture, Geronimus was too much of a coward to do the actual killing himself. He tried once, poisoned an infant who was crying too much and disturbing his sleep. The baby somehow survived the poison, probably because Geronimus was incompetent even at murder. Since he couldn't finish the job properly, he ordered one of his men to murder the child instead. Even genocide was something he had to delegate to others, a coward's kind of evil. Geronimus kept careful tabs on his island death camps through a telescope, watching the suffering like it was his personal entertainment. When the group on Seal Island wasn't dying fast enough for his taste, some of them were actually managing to find shellfish and rainwater. He sent a boat full of killers over to speed up the process. Just sat there watching through his scope like it was theatre. The screams probably carried across the water on quiet nights. Meanwhile, the soldiers on West Wallaby Island were not only surviving but actually thriving. They'd found plenty of fresh water from natural springs, and enough small marsupials, birds, and fish to keep everyone well fed and healthy. Military discipline and teamwork were paying off in ways Geronimus hadn't anticipated. For days they sent up smoke signals as ordered, completely clueless about the nightmare happening on Beacon Island. They thought they were helping by following orders and signaling their success. They had no idea those signals were supposed to be their death warrant. Then survivors from Seal Island showed up on a makeshift raft, half dead from thirst and starvation. That's when Vebi and his soldiers learned the horrifying truth about their new leader and what had really been happening while they were building their little paradise. Those smoke signals that had seemed like good news started worrying Geronimus seriously. He'd expected the soldiers to find nothing useful and die quietly of exposure like good little victims. Instead, they'd found critical resources and were not only surviving but sending signals that might attract passing ships. Worse, the smoke might draw rescue vessels to the wrong island first. If a rescue ship reached the soldiers before coming to Beacon Island, they'd tell everyone what Geronimus had been doing. Game over, Execution time for the mass murderer. The soldiers had become his biggest threat. They had to go, and soon. Wiebe wasn't stupid, and he definitely wasn't naive about human nature after years of military service. He knew Geronimus would come for them eventually. It was just a matter of when and how many killers he'd bring along for the party. The soldiers immediately started making crude but effective weapons with whatever materials they could find scattered around the island. Sharpened sticks, clubs made from driftwood, spears tipped with sharp stones and coral. They used limestone blocks, chunks of coral, and debris from the wrecked Batavia that had washed up on shore to build a small but sturdy fortress. Round-the-clock watches got set up with overlapping fields of vision. When the killers came, and they would definitely come, the soldiers would be ready to give them a warm welcome. Military training was about to pay off in ways the Dutch East India Company never intended. While all this desperate preparation was happening on the islands, something absolutely miraculous occurred back in civilization. After 33 days at sea in an open longboat, Francisco's impossible journey actually succeeded. Nearly 50 people crammed into a boat designed for short-distance emergency transport somehow survived 1,800 miles of open ocean. The odds against them were astronomical. Storms, dehydration, starvation, exposure, getting lost, capsizing, any one of a dozen things should have killed them all. Even today, maritime experts consider it one of the most incredible feats of seamanship and survival in recorded history. Francisco immediately met with the Governor-General in Batavia and spilled everything he knew about the shipwreck and the problems that had been brewing during the voyage. Some crew members had finally told him about Ariane and Geronimus planning a mutiny, information they'd kept secret during the worst parts of their ocean crossing. Indonesian authorities arrested Ariane on the spot. Finally, some justice for the man whose incompetent navigation had caused the wreck in the first place. But nobody in Batavia knew the full scope of what was happening back on Beacon Island during their absence. They thought they were dealing with a failed mutiny and some survivors who needed rescue. They had no idea they were actually dealing with an ongoing massacre that had turned a shipwreck into something much worse, a study in human evil when civilization breaks down completely. Francisco left Batavia a week later in a ship called Saardam, borrowed from the Governor-General. The rescue mission was on. No more sitting around feeling sorry for himself. Time to save whoever was left. The journey back to hell took forever. A month just to reach the Houtman Abrolhos Islands. Then, another month spent searching for one tiny sand pile among 122 similar islands. Like looking for a specific grain of rice in a bowl full of rice. Francisco's crew was getting restless, supplies were running low, and hope was starting to feel like a luxury they couldn't afford. Meanwhile, back in early August, just as Francisco was reaching Batavia, soldiers on West Wallaby Island spotted trouble on the horizon. A longboat heading their way with bad intentions written all over it. Geronimus had sent a small crew to wipe out what he thought were 22 unarmed, helpless soldiers sitting ducks. The psychopath couldn't have been more wrong. When the killers reached West Wallaby Island, expecting an easy slaughter, the soldiers were ready and waiting. They attacked immediately with their crude but effective weapons. The would-be assassins got caught completely off guard and retreated back to Beacon Island with their tails between their legs and their egos thoroughly crushed. Geronimus was absolutely furious when his men returned, defeated and humiliated. His grand plan was falling apart. He ordered a second attack and decided to go along this time, convinced he could intimidate the soldiers into joining his twisted cause through sheer force of personality. More men, better planning, same disastrous result. The soldiers were ready for round two. Before he could escape back to his island kingdom, Wiebe and his men captured Geronimus along with 3 of his top lieutenants. Some killers managed to escape back to Beacon Island, but many lay dead in the sand, their blood mixing with the surf. Geronimus got front row seats to watch as his precious lieutenants were executed one by one. Sweet justice. Back on Beacon Island, Geronimus's remaining killers were leaderless and desperate. They regrouped under a new boss, Wouterloos, who was just as twisted as his predecessor but maybe even more ruthless. Late September, they sailed back to West Wallaby Island for round 3 against the soldiers. This time they brought the big guns, muskets that Geronimus had been hoarding to hijack any rescue ship that might show up. The soldiers had fought brilliantly with their crude weapons, but crude weapons versus muskets? Not much of a contest. Physics doesn't care about courage. The soldiers fought like hell anyway, because that's what soldiers do, but it looked like their incredible luck had finally run out. Death was coming for the good guys this time. Then someone spotted salvation on the horizon. A ship. Fighting stopped instantly like someone had hit a pause button. Both sides wanted that ship desperately, but for completely different reasons. The soldiers saw rescue. The killers saw their next victims. Francisco had been sailing around in circles for weeks on the Sardam, checking every useless island twice, when he finally spotted smoke to the west. His tired eyes perked up for the first time in days. He thought the smoke was coming from a different island between West Wallaby and Beacon Island. Classic Francisco navigation skills, still terrible after all this time. He anchored as close as possible and took a longboat to shore with water, bread, and wine, basic supplies for whoever was making that smoke. The island was completely empty when he arrived. No fire, no people, no explanation for the smoke he'd clearly seen. The smoke was actually coming from further west, mocking his navigation skills once again. As he turned to leave, feeling frustrated and foolish, he saw another boat racing toward him with 4 men paddling like their lives depended on it. Which, as it turned out, they absolutely did. He immediately recognized the lead figure, Weeby Hayes, the soldier who'd been left to die but refused to cooperate with that plan. Weeby's boat hit the beach hard and he jumped out screaming at Francisco before his feet even touched sand. No time for pleasantries or proper greetings. Francisco, Weeby, and the 3 soldiers with him immediately raced back to the Sardam to warn the crew and defend the ship. Lives depended on speed now. On the way, Weber filled Francisco in on 3 months of pure nightmare that had unfolded while he was gone. Mass murder, torture, rape, cannibalism, everything that makes humans into monsters. Francisco's face went pale as the horrific details poured out. His worst fears about leaving hadn't been nearly bad enough. Not much time to process the horror story properly. Wouter and his killers were heading for the Sardam at exactly the same time, hoping to catch the rescue ship off guard. A race against time and death. Luckily, Francisco's boat got there first by mere minutes. He shouted orders for defensive positions, his voice cracking with urgency. When Wouter's boat pulled alongside the Sardam, and his men started climbing aboard with murder in their eyes, they found Francisco, and dozens of muskets pointed straight at their faces. The tables had turned completely. Game over for the killers. They dropped their weapons immediately and surrendered without a fight. Bullies always fold when they face real opposition. Every remaining mutineer got captured within minutes. Francisco started learning the full scope of the atrocities that had happened during his 3-month absence. The stories got worse with each confession. One 49-year-old killer was especially chatty about his involvement, bragging about murdering up to 20 innocent people on Geronimus's orders like it was some kind of achievement. Just another day at the office for these psychopaths. Evil had become routine. Francisco demanded to see Geronimus immediately. No delays, no excuses. They led him to the makeshift shelter, where the mass murderer was being held captive like the animal he'd become. Francisco launched into accusations based on everything he'd heard from the survivors. The litany of crimes was staggering. Geronimus blamed everyone and everything except himself for what had happened. Classic sociopath behavior. Refused to confess to anything, despite overwhelming evidence. Even faced with dozens of witness testimonies, he maintained his innocence like a man with nothing to lose because he'd already lost his humanity. Francisco wasn't having any of it. He set up formal investigations and trials right there on the island, determined to get justice for the victims. No bureaucratic delays, no legal technicalities. The awful details of murders, rapes, and assaults came pouring out from survivor after survivor. Horror story after horror story. By the end of the investigation, every single mutineer had confessed to their crimes except Geronimus. He was still playing innocent, still denying reality even as the evidence mounted like a mountain of corpses. The worst killers got death sentences. No appeals, no mercy. The 2nd of October, 1629 became execution day. They brought the condemned to Seal Island, where other survivors had been forced to build gallows with their own hands. Poetic justice in the making. Before hanging, each killer had their right hand chopped off as a final punishment. Many survivors gathered to watch with relief and satisfaction as the worst mutineers got dragged to the gallows one by one. Justice was finally being served. Geronimus got special treatment befitting the ringleader of evil. Both hands removed before they hanged him. Even in death, he got the extra punishment he richly deserved. The monster was finally dead. Lesser criminals got different punishments that fit their smaller roles in the horror show. One defecting soldier and a cabin boy who had defended Geronimus got marooned on mainland Australia with basic supplies, left to fend for themselves in a hostile wilderness. Ironically, these two criminals became the first Europeans to live permanently on the Australian continent. History remembers them as celebrated pioneers and early settlers, despite being abandoned there as punishment for their crimes. Sometimes history has a twisted sense of humour. The Sardam left the Houtman Abrolhos with 77 traumatized survivors and 16 mutineers bound for official trials in Batavia. The journey home became its own form of justice. 5 mutineers didn't even make it that far. They got flogged, keel-hauled, and dropped from high above the ship into the ocean during the voyage. The crew had their own ideas about justice. Wouter's crimes were almost as heinous as Geronimus's, but Francisco decided to bring him to Batavia for a proper trial rather than execute him on the spot. His punishment ended up being the worst of all, the breaking wheel. A fate worse than simple hanging. Being broken on the wheel was the most gruesome punishment available in that era. Pure medieval torture designed to maximize suffering. The condemned got systematically mangled until they could be tied to a large wooden wheel. More torture happened as the wheel spun slowly. Eventually, the whole contraption got set on fire high above a crowd of spectators who came to watch justice being served. There was one tiny mercy built into this horrific punishment. If someone fell off the wheel at any point during the torture, it was considered a sign from God to show mercy and spare their life. Wouter stayed firmly attached to his wheel throughout the entire ordeal. Even God wanted him dead. Ariane got physically punished by Batavian officials but maintained his innocence through every beating and interrogation. Never confessed to anything despite clear evidence of his role in planning the original mutiny. Eventually they let him go for lack of concrete proof. The guy who started the whole bloody mess with his schemes walked away relatively unscathed. Sometimes the worst criminals are also the smartest. Wiebe became a genuine hero throughout the Dutch colonies. Got promoted to a much higher military rank for his incredible bravery in fighting off the mutineers and capturing Geronimus alive. His courage had saved dozens of lives. The island even got nicknamed Wiebe Hayes Island in his honour, and the name stuck for centuries. Today, a bronze statue of Wiebe stands proudly on the Western Australian coast, commemorating his heroic stand against evil. Remains of the fortress he built are still clearly visible on the island, believed to be the oldest European structure ever built on Australian land. A monument to courage in the face of unspeakable horror. Francisco faced the cruelest irony of all. For all his desperate effort to reach help and organize a rescue mission that saved dozens of lives, he got blamed by officials for poor leadership and abandoning his post. They said he should have set up proper military command before leaving for Australia. Bureaucrats always find someone to blame. His reputation was completely destroyed, his assets seized by the government. The man who'd sailed 1,800 miles in an open boat to save people got treated like a criminal. He died from an unspecified illness within a year of returning to Batavia, broken and forgotten. Heroes don't always get happy endings. When the Batavia left the Netherlands in October 1628, it carried between 322 and 341 hopeful people seeking new lives in the spice trade. Only 122 made it to Batavia alive, a survival rate of barely 1 in 3. Geronimus was directly responsible for killing at least 109 castaways through murder, torture, and deliberate abandonment. Some estimates put his victim count as high as 125 innocent people. The rest died from illness, starvation, drowning, or the original shipwreck that started this nightmare. A maritime disaster that became something much worse, a study in human evil. The Batavia wreck itself was lost to time and weather until marine archaeologists located it in 1963. Now visitors can see the reconstructed bow remains at the Western Australia Museum in Perth, a sombre monument to one of history's most horrific maritime disasters and the depths of human cruelty when civilization breaks down.